Jennifer, as you peer forward into the future, how has the future changed for this segment, from a commerce perspective, but also the digital payments field?
I think we'll continue to see mobile, internet, and certainly collaboration technologies continue to grow and dominate and really change the way we interact with one another and with businesses as we're going forward. I think some people think because when we launched the iPhone now, I think almost 13 years ago, there's been, there's some reflection, oh, well, there's not much innovation left. But actually, I can give you some great examples of things that we're just on the beginning of that are also really being propelled forward by the pandemic. One example and is something that we do around access with student IDs. So we have many universities, unfortunately not yet Middlebury, to allow students to put their student ID in their iPhone or Apple Watch and then tap to get into the dorm. Tap to access food at the cafeteria, tap to check out library books, tap to check in at the gym or to do virtually anything that you do with your ID today. We also just announced BMW is using our technology for car keys. And so if you think about access as a broad and general category, being able to use our mobile devices in a touchless way, which again is very popular right now given the concerns around the pandemic, that will continue to evolve over the next 5 years or even 10 years. We're also doing things like touchless transit. So think of all the ways that you interact in the physical world today. We're just beginning to see the changes in these industries, whether it's corporate office buildings, sports venues, again, transit, renting a scooter. All these things are going to continue to change at a rapid pace as we, again, bring mobile technology and in particular touchless technologies into the ways that you interact with the physical world. So I think that'll continue to be very big changes here. And again, that's just one of the many areas that we see. At Apple, we have many creative type of roles, whether that's developing content in any of our media businesses. Apple TV Plus, right, is something where we actually develop our own content. In other businesses, we're looking at how we aggregate content. How do we editorialize the important news of the day, as an example, in our news feeds? How do we create awareness and personalization around the types of games that you might like on the App Store? These are all non-technical jobs. They are about understanding what consumers love, what's the benefit, how do people use these things. So there are many opportunities, not only in sort of the creative development, but I would also say in things like market research, consumer research. One of the projects that I recently worked on was Apple Card. And as we looked at Apple Card, we spent a lot of time understanding behavioral economics, which is the study of how people feel about and how they manage their money and their finances. That's really psychology. That's really market research and consumer research. It's not really the technology of it. It's how people, again, feel and think. And then what do we need to do to how we think about changing behavior? So I think in many, many segments of the differences of the businesses, there are creative roles, there are research roles, there are writing roles. And all of these things can be brought to bear to create a better technology experience.
So I would imagine as we go forward in time, we might expect the disappearance of cash money in the future. For those of us of my age, I certainly still do carry some cash in my pocket when I travel, just in case. So I can imagine that disappearing as we go forward. How about for those that are currently using products like, let's say, Venmo?
Yeah.
That change as we go forward and be enhanced, that experience.
Yeah, we have something very similar to Venmo called Apple Cash, which works between Apple users. And so person-to-person payments is growing significantly. I think, again, you'll continue to see it go. I don't We don't talk about the disappearances of cash. We don't think about that. There are many use cases for cash, like tipping. You know, when you're parking your car, if you still drive a car, which we may not in the future, as an example. But I think you know, there's some very key use cases where it's just still easier. So we haven't solved all of the environmental you know, situations where you might want to use cash. Certainly if you're just going into a store, yeah, that should go away. You know, if you're buying online, obviously it already has. It's never been really available except in certain countries with a pay on delivery type of model. So I do think we'll continue to see the growth of person-to-person payments. I think the other thing that you'll see is that more broadly, real-time payments. So using rails where the money is actually being transferred real-time between banks and businesses, between, you know, person to person. Today, as you know, most of the money movement is not really real time. Sometimes it feels real time, but it's actually not. And there's a huge benefit to moving in that way in the future. And you see many countries actually ahead of the US in this journey.
You mentioned the US versus the rest of the world. It's something that I haven't thought a lot about, but it is a curiosity to me, you know, why the US seems to lag other countries, other parts of the world in the adoption and use of electronic payment and digital payment.
Yeah, there are multiple reasons. Let's start with regulatory. In many countries, the regulatory framework is progressive and strict. In the US, you know, we're very democratic. It's very hard to get agreement, especially now, into agreeing how we should, you know, change policy or in the context of regulation. So in Europe, as an example, there's something called PSD2, which is a set of regulations associated with doing better authentication online so that your payment is safer. This is very progressive, and it is coming from regulators on an EU basis, so companies have to adopt it. We in the US are not close to doing anything like that, and so that's a big factor. I think the other factor is that you see a much the US is a very large and diverse market. We have, you know, something on the order of over 7,000 banking institutions. If you look outside the US, even in countries like the UK, you know, you're gonna reach about 98, 99% coverage with, let's say, less than 50 banks. And so getting 7,000 to move versus 50 is a very different scenario. And then of course you have countries like China, where regulation goes even to a new level, where they are really dictating very specifically the process, the procedures, and the support that the banks have to do. So when a country like China decides, you know, we want to move to real-time payments, it's you'll do real-time payments by this time frame, as an example. Very different than how the US works. So I'd say it's a combination of the diversity of the market and the regulatory framework that we see these significant differences across the world. Apple Pay is in over 50 countries, including places like China, many countries in the EU, nearly all of the EEA countries, Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong. And I would say the dynamics of the business are very different depending on where you are. In many countries outside the US, contactless technology at point of sale has been around for a very long time. In the US, we really just started transitioning to it when we launched Apple Pay. In the US, when we launched Apple Pay, there was only 3% contactless coverage for merchant locations. Now, I think as we look at particularly this year with COVID, et cetera, we're probably gonna reach over 80% coverage. So that's a huge growth in a very short amount of time. Having said that, I would say the US is a great market for Apple Pay, but as we actually look at some of our external markets, again, where contactless has been around, where there's more concentration in terms of the partners and merchants and banks, we see actually higher adoption of Apple Pay outside the US in many countries.